About which part of the tariffs that Canada has announced.
For years, Canada and the U.S. have been close allies. But now, that friendship is crumbling. Fed up with Trump's tariffs, insults, and threats, Canadians are pulling their money out of the United States, and fast. Investment sell-offs, a collapsing housing market, and a wave of canceled travel plans are sending shockwaves through American businesses. But here's the real question. Can this boycott actually force the U.S. to change course? Or is this just the beginning of a much bigger economic showdown? Let's break it down. What's happening? This is a surprise for almost everyone in the world, because we have only seen these two countries in harmony, working hand in hand, not just in trade, but in tourism, investment, much more. Basically, anything necessary for one side has flowed freely between the two nations, strengthening their economies and creating jobs on both sides of the border. However, Donald Trump's aggressive rhetoric against Canada has triggered an unprecedented backlash, leading many Canadians to take drastic action, pulling their money out of the United States. Trump's repeated claims that Canada is taking advantage of the United States, his threats of tariffs, and his dismissive remarks about Canada's sovereignty have angered many Canadians. What once seemed like political bluster is now viewed by many as a serious threat to Canada's economic and national stability. As a result, Canadians are responding in the most impactful way possible, with their wallets. In recent months, a growing number of Canadian investors have begun selling off their U.S. assets, including stocks, real estate, and business investments. Some are divesting from American companies entirely, choosing instead to invest in European and Asian markets. Others are offloading vacation homes and rental properties in popular U.S. destinations like Florida and Arizona, where thousands of Canadians traditionally spend their winters. This isn't just about economics, it's about principle. Many Canadians see their financial decisions as a stand against what they view as authoritarianism, protectionism, and a growing disregard for international allies. The scale of this economic resistance is staggering. What started as individual acts of protest is now turning into a collective movement, one that has the potential to reshape U.S.-Canada relations for years to come. But this isn't just about a few investors. An entire movement is forming, the nationwide boycott. What began as a financial shift among wealthy investors has now turned into a full-scale economic boycott. Across Canada, businesses, consumers, and even local governments are re-evaluating their economic ties to the United States. The impact is already being felt across multiple industries. The real estate market, particularly in states like Arizona and Florida, is one of the first to feel the effects. Canadians own a significant portion of vacation homes in these states, and as they begin selling off their properties, the supply of available homes is rising, while demand is dropping. This sudden sell-off is starting to put downward pressure on property values, worrying American homeowners and real estate agents alike. Some realtors in Florida have reported a surge in Canadian clients looking to sell, with some homes sitting on the market for months due to the increasing inventory. But it's not just real estate. Canadian businesses are also reassessing their reliance on U.S. suppliers and shifting towards alternatives in Europe and Asia. Some major Canadian retailers have begun sourcing products from non-U.S. manufacturers to avoid potential tariffs and economic instability. Others are cutting ties with American service providers in favor of domestic or international options. Tourism is another area where the boycott is taking its toll. Historically, Canadian tourists contribute billions of dollars to the U.S. economy each year, with millions traveling to popular destinations like Florida, California, and New York. However, with rising anti-U.S. sentiment and fears of economic uncertainty, many Canadians are opting to travel elsewhere. Airlines and travel agencies have reported a drop in demand for U.S. flights, and some Canadian tourists are even canceling planned trips in protest. For many U.S. businesses, the boycott is a quiet but growing concern. Unlike government-imposed tariffs, This economic resistance is driven by individuals and businesses making independent decisions. There's no central authority to negotiate with, just millions of Canadians choosing to take their money elsewhere. And the financial fallout from this boycott is already snowballing, the billions at stake. Canada is the United States' largest trading partner, and the economic ties between the two nations support millions of jobs. However, with the Canadian boycott gaining momentum, that economic relationship is now at risk. If just 10% of Canadian tourists decide to cancel their U.S. trips, the impact could be devastating. Tourism experts estimate that such a reduction could lead to a loss of more than 100,000 American jobs, particularly in cities and states that rely heavily on Canadian visitors. Hotels, restaurants, and attractions are already feeling the effects, with some reporting lower than expected bookings from Canadian travelers. Real estate markets in U.S. vacation hotspots are also beginning to soften, as Canadian property owners sell their homes and fewer Canadian buyers enter the market. With increased supply and decreased demand, property values in certain areas may continue to decline, creating a ripple effect in local economies. Beyond real estate and tourism, the broader economic impact could be even more severe. Trade between the United States and Canada amounts to hundreds of billions of dollars annually. If Canadian businesses continue shifting away from American suppliers and consumers increasingly favor domestic products, the long-term consequences could be significant. Some economists warn that if this trend continues, it could contribute to a slowdown in certain sectors of the U.S. economy, particularly those reliant on Canadian buyers. The longer this boycott lasts, the more deeply it will affect both economies. While some U.S. businesses hope the movement will fade over time, others worry that Canada's shift away from the United States could become a permanent trend. But beyond economics, there's a much bigger issue: sovereignty and identity. Trump's attack on Canada's sovereignty. The economic battle between Canada and the United States is not just about money, it's about national identity. Donald Trump's dismissive remarks about Canada, including his suggestion that it should be treated as the 51st state, have struck a nerve with many Canadians. Rather than intimidating Canada into compliance, his rhetoric has had the opposite effect, fueling national pride and strengthening the country's resolve to assert its independence. For many Canadians, Trump's comments are seen as an insult to their nation's sovereignty. Canada has a long history of standing on its own, and the idea of being reduced to a mere extension of the United States is deeply offensive to many citizens. As a result, there has been a surge in patriotic sentiment, with many Canadians actively seeking ways to support their own economy and reduce dependence on the U.S. Even in the United States, some public figures have criticized Trump's approach. American commentators, business leaders, and even politicians have expressed concern that Trump's antagonistic stance toward Canada is harming an important ally. Some have warned that his rhetoric is not only damaging economic ties, but also eroding diplomatic relationships that have been built over decades. Rather than bowing to U.S. pressure, Canada is responding by strengthening its economic independence. Government officials are actively exploring new trade agreements with European and Asian partners, aiming to reduce reliance on the U.S. market. Businesses are diversifying their supply chains, and consumers are making conscious decisions to support Canadian-made products. In many ways, Trump's aggressive approach has only accelerated a shift that was already beginning. Instead of reinforcing U.S. economic dominance, his actions have pushed Canada further toward self-sufficiency and international cooperation. And that independence means Canada is looking beyond the U.S. for its future, breaking the trade chains. Canada has already strengthened its trade ties with the European Union through the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, which eliminates nearly all tariffs between the two regions. This agreement has given Canadian exporters access to over 440 million European consumers, providing a powerful alternative to U.S. markets. Similarly, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade pact with 11 Pacific Rim countries, has opened doors for Canadian goods and services in fast-growing Asian economies like Japan, Vietnam, and Australia. Meanwhile, Latin America is becoming an increasingly attractive trading partner. Canada has long-standing trade relationships with Mexico, Chile, and Peru, and recent discussions have pointed toward expanding economic ties with Brazil and Argentina. As Canadian companies explore these new markets, they are reducing their dependence on American suppliers and customers. The shift is not just happening at the governmental level. Canadian businesses are also proactively looking beyond the U.S. for manufacturing and supply chain solutions, diversifying their operations to avoid reliance on an unpredictable American political climate. If this trend continues, America's dominance in North American trade could shrink significantly. The economic bond between Canada and the U.S. has long been taken for granted, but this new era of diversification suggests that the Canadian economy is moving toward a more independent future, one where it is no longer at the mercy of U.S. political whims. And if Canada succeeds in finding new trade routes, what does this mean for the U.S. economy? Will the U.S. recession follow? The United States has long enjoyed its role as Canada's primary trading partner, benefiting from Canadian investments in real estate, tourism, retail, and other major sectors. However, as Canada pulls back, the economic consequences for the U.S. are becoming impossible to ignore. Losing Canada as a top investor and trading partner could destabilize key industries, contributing to a broader economic downturn. One of the first sectors feeling the impact is real estate. In places like Arizona and Florida, where thousands of Canadians own winter homes, a sell-off has begun. Real estate agents are reporting an increase in listings from Canadian homeowners who no longer wish to keep their assets in the U.S. This flood of homes hitting the market is already driving down property values in these regions. And if it continues, local real estate markets could experience a prolonged slump. Beyond real estate, tourism is another industry bracing for losses. Canadians are among the largest groups of foreign visitors to the U.S., contributing billions of dollars each year to states like Florida, California, and Nevada. With many Canadians now boycotting American travel destinations, hotels, restaurants, and tourist attractions are seeing fewer visitors. If this trend continues, thousands of jobs in the tourism sector could be at risk. If other countries decide to follow Canada's lead and pull their investments from the U.S., the consequences could be even more severe. A growing resistance to U.S. economic policies could create ripple effects across multiple industries, weakening the country's economic standing. While a full-blown recession may not happen overnight, the warning signs are clear. The U.S. economy is vulnerable, and the loss of Canada as a key economic partner only increases that risk. And speaking of other countries, what are their responses to all of this? Could this boycott inspire a global movement? Could this spark an international boycott? Canada may be leading the charge against U.S. economic dominance, but it is far from alone in its frustrations with American trade policies. Many European nations have expressed similar grievances over Trump's tariffs, isolationist stance, and aggressive economic tactics. The question now is whether Canada's actions could serve as a blueprint for a larger global boycott against the U.S. European nations, particularly Germany and France, have been vocal critics of Trump's trade wars. The European Union has already imposed counter tariffs on American goods in response to U.S. protectionist policies, and many European leaders have called for reducing reliance on American imports. If Canada's economic pushback proves effective, it could embolden European nations to take similar steps, accelerating the shift away from American economic influence. Mexico is another country closely watching the situation. As one of the largest trading partners of the U.S., Mexico has repeatedly clashed with Trump over tariffs and immigration policies. If Canada successfully reduces its dependence on American trade, Mexico may be incentivized to do the same, seeking alternative partners in Latin America and Asia. China, which has been engaged in a prolonged trade war with the U.S., could also take inspiration from Canada's actions. Beijing has already made significant moves to reduce its reliance on U.S. technology and goods. investing in domestic supply chains and forging new economic alliances. A global trend of countries moving away from American trade could further erode the U.S.'s position as an economic superpower. If these global shifts continue, the long-standing assumption that the U.S. is the center of the global economy could be challenged. Countries are realizing that they do not need to be dependent on an increasingly unpredictable and politically volatile United States. If the momentum grows, the U.S. may find itself isolated in a way it has never experienced before. And with global shifts happening, is Trump's strategy a calculated risk or a major miscalculation? Trump's gamble? Will his America First strategy survive? Trump's economic policies have always been built on the idea of America First, putting U.S. interests ahead of global partnerships. Tariffs, trade wars, and aggressive rhetoric were all meant to strengthen the U.S. economy by forcing other nations to comply with American demands. But as Canada and potentially other countries begin to push back, the cracks in this strategy are becoming apparent. One of the biggest risks of Trump's approach is that it creates uncertainty for American businesses. Many industries, including agriculture, manufacturing, and retail, rely on stable international relationships to function effectively. As trade tensions escalate, these industries face disruptions that could lead to higher prices for consumers, supply chain breakdowns, and job losses. The auto industry is a prime example of how Trump's policies could backfire. Many U.S. car manufacturers depend on Canadian suppliers for essential parts. If Canada shifts its supply chain to other countries, American automakers could see rising production costs, making their vehicles less competitive in the global market. Trump's supporters have long backed his economic nationalism, believing that bringing jobs and production back to the U.S. would benefit American workers. However, if these policies continue to push allies like Canada away, the unintended consequences may hurt the very people Trump promised to protect. Small businesses, farmers, and manufacturers who rely on stable trade relationships could suffer the most. While Trump may see this as a bold move to assert U.S. economic dominance, the reality is that isolating America from its closest allies could have lasting consequences. If this boycott and trade shift continue, the long-term impact could weaken the U.S. economy rather than strengthen it. And if U.S. industries are at risk, what does this mean for American workers? Despite these economic warning signs, Trump's administration has remained defiant, dismissing concerns over job losses as temporary or exaggerated. However, for the American workers already facing unemployment or reduced income, the consequences of this economic battle are very real. But it's not just about business. Canada is preparing its next move. Canada's next steps: a permanent shift away from the U.S. While the United States grapples with the economic and political fallout, Canada is looking ahead. And many believe this boycott is not just a temporary protest, but the beginning of a major economic transformation. The relationship between the two nations has historically been one of deep economic interdependence. But with tensions at an all-time high, Canadian leaders are exploring new paths that could permanently alter the balance of power. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Canadian officials have made it clear that they will not be bullied into submission. Instead of backing down, they are doubling down on efforts to diversify trade and reduce reliance on the U.S. economy. Canada is actively strengthening its trade relationships with Europe, China, and other international markets through agreements like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Canada-European Union Trade Agreement. At the same time, Canadian businesses are accelerating efforts to shift supply chains away from U.S. suppliers. Industries that have long relied on American goods and services are looking for alternative partners in countries with stable trade policies. If this trend continues, it could weaken the U.S.'s dominance in North American trade, forcing American businesses to adapt or risk losing one of their biggest markets. Perhaps the most significant shift is in public sentiment. Many Canadians are no longer viewing the United States as the automatic go-to partner for trade and investment. While cultural ties remain strong, economic ties are becoming increasingly strained. Some experts believe that if this trend continues, Canada may never fully return to the old US-Canada relationship, even if Trump leaves office. If this boycott leads to long-term economic realignment, the implications could be enormous. For decades, Canada and the US have been economic allies, with trade policies designed around mutual prosperity. But if Canada permanently reduces its dependence on the American market, it could set a precedent for other nations to follow, further eroding US influence in global trade. And if Canada moves on, who is left to pick up the pieces? Who wins and who loses in this showdown? In every economic conflict, there are winners and losers. Trump may claim victory by standing firm on his trade policies. But at what cost? While he can boast about protecting American industries, the economic consequences of this standoff suggest that the real damage is happening behind the scenes. For Canada, the boycott may ultimately strengthen its economy by forcing diversification. If Canada successfully reduces its dependence on U.S. trade, it could emerge as a more resilient global player. Expanding partnerships with Europe, Asia, and Latin America would provide long-term economic security and reduce vulnerability to future U.S. policy changes. For American businesses, however, the outcome is far less favorable. Many companies, particularly those in manufacturing, agriculture, and tourism, are suffering significant losses. Small business owners who rely on Canadian customers are watching their revenues shrink, while major industries like steel and automotive are facing declining demand. These businesses are caught in the middle of a political battle that offers them no clear path to recovery. And what about American workers? The very people Trump claimed to be fighting for, factory workers, farmers, and service industry employees, are the ones paying the highest price. Layoffs, reduced wages, and declining economic prospects are becoming the norm for those who depend on cross-border trade. While Trump may declare victory in a political sense, the real question is whether his supporters will feel like winners when the dust settles. But this isn't over yet. The biggest question remains. What happens next? Will this boycott force the United States to change course? The economic consequences of the Canadian boycott are becoming harder to ignore. As Canadian investors pull their money out of U.S. markets and tourism dollars dry up, American businesses are beginning to feel the impact. Some industries, like real estate, retail, and tourism, are already in crisis mode. In states like Florida and Arizona, where Canadian buyers once fueled local economies, property values are dipping. Hotels that once catered to a steady stream of Canadian tourists are reporting a sharp decline in bookings. Local businesses, from restaurants to rental car agencies, are struggling to replace the lost revenue. The longer this continues, the more pressure will mount for Washington to intervene. If Canadian spending continues to decline, it could send shockwaves through multiple sectors, causing widespread job losses and economic instability. Many American business leaders are already pushing for a change in course. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce and multiple industry groups have urged the Trump administration to reconsider its approach. Even major corporations that once supported Trump's trade stance are now expressing concerns about long-term damage to cross-border business relations. While Trump's aggressive trade policies were designed to strengthen the American economy, they appear to be having the opposite effect. The backlash from Canada is only the latest in a series of economic disputes that have left American businesses uncertain about the future. If the Canadian boycott continues, it could be a tipping point that forces a broader reassessment of U.S. trade policies. The longer the U.S. government resists calls for change, the greater the risk of economic fallout that could extend beyond just U.S.-Canada relations. However, there is one major obstacle standing in the way of change: Trump himself. Throughout his presidency, he has doubled down on every trade war, often escalating conflicts rather than backing down. His brand is built on defiance, and admitting that his policies have hurt the U.S. economy would be a political liability. Even if advisors and business leaders warn him of the economic consequences, it remains unclear whether he would listen. His base sees his trade stance as a show of strength, and reversing course could be seen as weakness. The bigger question is, if Trump does decide to shift his stance, will Canada be willing to forgive and move forward? Or has the damage to US-Canada relations reached a point of no return? And if Canada is looking to the future, what should Canadians do now? Should Canadians keep up the boycott? The Canadian boycott of United States investments, real estate, and tourism has already made a significant impact, but the question remains, should it continue? Many Canadians believe this is the only way to send a strong message to the United States. They argue that backing down too soon would only reinforce the idea that Canada can be pushed around without consequences. For these individuals, the boycott is about more than just economic strategy. It is a statement of national pride, a stand against perceived unfair treatment, and a test of Canada's resolve on the world stage. At the same time, others worry about the potential downsides of prolonged economic separation. The United States remains Canada's largest trading partner, and maintaining strong economic ties benefits both nations. If the boycott continues indefinitely, it could lead to unintended consequences, such as higher costs for Canadian consumers, job losses in sectors that rely on American trade, and economic strain on businesses that depend on cross-border commerce. Some believe that while the boycott was a necessary response, it should be reassessed if the United States shows signs of changing its stance. Rather than an all-or-nothing approach, they argue for a strategic withdrawal, keeping pressure on critical industries while allowing for economic flexibility where needed. Ultimately, the decision lies with the people. This boycott isn't being dictated by government officials. It is a grassroots movement fueled by public frustration and a desire for fairness. As long as Canadians remain committed to pulling their investments and reducing their spending in the United States, American businesses will continue to feel the pressure. But will this movement have lasting power, or will it fade as economic conditions shift and political priorities change? As this historic economic standoff unfolds, the world is watching. Will Canada's boycott force a shift in U.S. policy, or will the American government hold firm despite the economic fallout? More importantly, could this conflict permanently reshape the future of North American trade? Let us know what you think in the comments. Should Canada stand its ground, or is it time to reconsider? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.